There were illustrators that went along in the field, and I think some of the illustrations were done, like of individuals like John Wilkes Booth. People had his picture. He was very famous. Probably more pictures of him, Lincoln and Custer, than anybody else back then.
So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ed Colimore. Ed, welcome, sir.
Hey, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. I hope I live up to all of that praise there. I've looked forward to joining you and want to thank my longtime friend, Andy Waskey, and for his invitation to talk about the legacy of freedom we enjoy. Also wanted to thank Herb Kaufman for getting me through the technical aspects of Zoom etiquette. And I'm going to see if I can't get up some of the images here. Let me see if I can do that. Let's see. Hold on one second here. Share. I got to hit share. That's what I got to do. Click. All right. 1 second here. There we go. All right. There we go. All right. Now we're in business. All right. So though I'll touch on the American Revolution, for this group, I wanted to focus more on the Civil War, and in particular, the newspaper coverage of the Civil War. Bear with me, I've had a cold, so I might sound a little rough in the throat. Over my 44 years as a newspaper reporter, columnist, and editor, I wrote hundreds of stories on the Civil War and Revolutionary War and on historic sites across Philadelphia. So many I began to feel like a correspondent from an earlier time. I interviewed the children of Civil War veterans. I covered enormous Civil War reenactments, joined divers on 2 expeditions to the wreck of the USS Monitor, and was on hand when its gun turret was recovered. I remember being on a vessel as the turret came up, and there was a flyover by jets. And then I went over to the dredge barge where they put the turret and climbed up a rope ladder and put my hand in the indentations in the turret where cannonballs from the CSS Virginia or Merrimack, whatever you want to call it, struck the turret. I have searched through the Rancocas Creek using side scan sonar with people who were looking for a prototype of a Civil War submarine that was developed in Philadelphia. And we went through a swamp right along the creek, followed the route of John Wilkes Booth, who, as you know, assassinated Lincoln, and went on that full route to the place where he finally met his end. So I guess it was natural for the Inquire to approach me about writing a book on the role of the paper, the Inquire, and the press in general during the war. And that book became Eyewitness Reports, the Inquire's live coverage of the American Civil War. I had also written stories about nearly every Revolutionary War site in the Philadelphia area, so the paper asked me to write another book about the history of the city, neighborhood by neighborhood. That became the Philadelphia Inquire's walking tours of historic Philadelphia. And this is the 4th edition that was produced less than a year ago. A little background on how I became so interested in history. I was born in Baltimore in 1950, so I remember the Civil War centennial was in the news and books and movies and reenactments. I spent summers in Virginia at my grandmother's house in a small railroad town called Crewe on the Norfolk and Western line. There you can see the roundhouse there in Crewe. My father had a single engine plane in the 1930s and early 40s, just before the war. And he would fly up to Crewe to take my mother on a date. And then he would tip the wing and take a picture. And there's crew. I would go out to the roundhouse and put pennies on the track. And this is what happens when you put a penny on the track and a steam locomotive passes over it. So it would only take a couple pictures you can see the coal cars there if you're seeing the picture. And here is the rest of crew. Not much to it. My grandmother was the daughter of Lee Jackson Davis. And you can see him there on the steps with the mustache. Lee Jackson Davis, I guess you can't get much more Confederate than that. My grandmother is sitting to his left, right behind him. And then he was the son of a Confederate soldier, Richard Hiram Davis. And that's him in his 70s. He still had a Yankee mini ball in his side. He was a carpenter who built railroad cars. But when the war broke out, he joined the 41st Virginia Infantry and fought in the Peninsula Campaign, eventually getting shot and captured at the Battle of Fair Oaks, Seven Pines in 1862. He was exchanged, recovered from his wound, and went into the lines around Petersburg, where he was captured again. And you can see his record there of capture and release. Every summer when I was growing up, I always knew when our 54 Ford crossed into Virginia, we start seeing Stuckey's restaurants and Confederate flags and fireworks stands. And my grandmother's house was flanked by weeping willows that had a porch with white columns and an inviting swing. At night, as I laid in bed with a breeze rustling the curtains, I'd hear steam engines chugging through town ahead of a long line of cars loaded with coal. My grandfather was a railroad conductor, and his office was the caboose. Sometimes my great uncle, John Davis, he was also on those steps with the man with the mustache. He's the son of Lee Jackson Davis. He lived nearby. He would let me ride in the bed of his pickup truck on the way to his farm, where I'd get a chance to shoot guns and watch him plow a field or slop hogs. He was a World War I veteran who still suffered after effects from a gas attack. One of the high points of the summer was a visit from my mother's brother, my Uncle Ed, who I was named for. He'd see me on my grandmother's porch and say, "Come on, boy, let's take a ride." And we'd hop into his 56 Chevy Bel Air and head down narrow country roads until he'd pull over next to a farm field, one that was freshly plowed. And Uncle Ed then would walk across the soft ground and start picking up pieces of dirt, crumble it in his hand. And then after he'd crumble it in his hand, he'd inside there he would find a mini ball. And this is one of them that he picked up. He'd find buttons, a jagged piece of shrapnel, the end of a spyglass. We were on privately owned land with permission of the Sailors Creek battlefield. And the ground was still regurgitating a fight that happened there in 1865. By the 1970s, I was an investigative reporter at the Baltimore News American, but every so often I got a chance to write about the area's history. We had Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key, the national anthem, Constellation, the B&O Museum, Flag House, and Edgar Allan Poe House. And of course, we have in Philadelphia, the Edgar Allan Poe House on 7th Street, but they had one in Baltimore, and I was looking for it one time, this is before GPS, I was looking for it in Baltimore and stopped to ask directions from the disheveled looking man sitting on the steps of his row home. I said, "Do you know where the Poe House is?" And he laughed and said, "Brother, you found it. This is the Poe House." He meant poorhouse, but I was looking for Edgar Allan Poe House. For 10 years in Baltimore and 34 years in Philadelphia, I covered just about everything. I interviewed survivors of the Titanic, including, there's Edgar Allan Poe, of course. That's a great picture of him. It's very detailed. But I interviewed survivors of the Titanic, including Melvina Dean. She was very young at the time the Titanic went down, and she had to leave her father. Her mother took her onto a lifeboat, and she, never saw her father again. I interviewed survivors of the Hindenburg disaster and Colonel Paul Tibbets, who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and scores of World War II veterans, including those who survived D-Day, Iwo Jima, the Battle of the Bulge, the Malmedy Massacre. I flew in a B-17 bomber and P-51 Mustang from World War II. I hitched a ride on a C-17 to Afghanistan, Qatar, and Germany, and jumped off a parachute training tower at Fort Bragg. One of the children of the Civil War veterans I interviewed was Claire Mulholland Dobbin, the daughter of Union General St. Clair Mulholland. Claire told me her father used to have other Union veterans over to the house, and he would project with, she's called it a magic lantern, glass negatives of Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner on the wall and talk about the war with other veterans. She said that he also took her to Fredericksburg, and they got in a buggy with a box of ice in the buggy, I guess to keep them cool. And they went out to the Fredericksburg battlefield, and he pointed to the place where he was wounded and fell. He used the mini ball that was removed from him as a watch fob. And I remember at the Pine Street Museum seeing a sash that he wore that was stained with his blood. Over the years, I interviewed a 1960s activist, Angela Davis, soul singer James Brown, other entertainers such as Red Skelton, Ginger Rogers, Carol Channing, and politicians such as Ted Kennedy, Arlen Specter, and Frank Rizzo. But the stories about the Civil War always stuck with me, like the time I visited a gray sandstone recreation of the White House in Richmond. It was called the Home for Needy Confederate Widows, and it had become a nursing home because the widows were all gone by the time I got there, a nursing home for the children of Confederate soldiers. The building could hold 100, but when I got there, only 8 were left, including the daughter of one of Mosby's Rangers. I remember walking down the hall, and there was an elderly lady playing a piano, an old song, and the place was filled with antique furniture. I believe the university there took it over, and they moved the ladies into a more modern facility. During the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, I covered a huge reenactment held near the battlefield. My editor, Gene Roberts, asked me to go as a reporter reenactor. And there I am in all my glory back then. He wanted me to cover the event from inside. Andy Waskey was very helpful to me in putting me together with a unit, and I wrote several very long stories that were later republished in tabloid form. This is a picture of reenactors here. That was probably must have been the largest reenactment I had ever attended. I was actually back here with the Union forces, but I was on deadline, and I had to quickly run down the side of the battlefield. And there were spectators on the side, and I ran down along the spectators and then up a hill, and then called in a story. I had to call in and over the phone. Other stories I had done on what they call Radio Shack. We called it a Trash 80. It had almost no memory at all. So I guess you could say I was one of the last Civil War era reporters. I also covered the filming of the movie Gettysburg and witnessed Pickett's charge. The most chilling part for me was when the Confederates were ordered to fix bayonets. And I heard a sound that no one probably heard there on that ground since the battle. And that was the clinking noises, thousands of clinking noises of bayonets being shoved on the ends of muskets. And that was very chilling. Whenever I wasn't covering a political campaign or a federal trial or other news event, I looked for ways of writing about the Civil War. It became so obvious to my colleagues that they had a saying that I don't especially like that much, but they said, if it's dead, it's Ed. So Philadelphia is a treasure trove of history. I mean, more than 300 years ago, William Penn set out to create his green country town, which, quote, would never be burnt and always be wholesome. This was the birthplace of freedom, where the Declaration of Independence, Constitution were written and debated. The nation's greatest leaders, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Patrick Henry. They walked these streets of Philadelphia. They worshiped in the churches. They lived out the most dramatic period of their lives. If you think about it, much of Philadelphia that existed during the Revolution and Civil War is still standing here today. Here you see I don't know if I can, if you see my cursor on it, this is the Philadelphia Exchange. And here is the first Bank of the United States. Carpenter's Hall, Second Bank of the United States, and Independence Hall back here. Here's, again, Independence Hall, the rear of it. This is the Liberty Bell Pavilion. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Liberty Bell Pavilion. Visitor Center here. Constitution Center is back here further. You can't see it. I believe this building here, this is, as I understand it, where the Philadelphia Inquirer is going to move. It's moving from Market Street to right over here to Independence Mall. Over here's the Bourse. So here's a close-up of the Philadelphia Exchange. It's a beautiful building. And the first Bank of the United States again. Second Bank, Independence Hall. And oops, not there yet. And this is Christ Church. These are the same buildings the journalists saw as they walked the city streets during the Civil War. Nearby, as you've already seen, is Fort Mifflin, where a Union deserter was hung during the war, and further south on the Delaware River was Fort Delaware on Pea Patch Island, where Confederate prisoners were held during the war. I think some of those from Gettysburg were captured at Gettysburg were taken there. And of course, at Fence Point, there are Confederate soldiers buried there. When I began working on eyewitness reports, the Inquirer's live coverage of the American Civil War, one of the first places I wanted to visit was South Mountain. There on the side of a winding road is a strange medieval looking monument. A battle was fought there in 1862 as Union forces drove Confederates toward the sleepy town of Sharpsburg. But this odd out of place memorial on Gapland Road does not commemorate the heroic deeds of soldiers. Over the great central arch of the monument are large letters in red brick. I wish I had a color picture, but here you see along here, war correspondence. And a concrete tablet on the one side says, to the Army correspondents and artists, 1861 to 65, whose toils cheered the camps, thrilled the fireside, educated provinces of rustics into a bright nation of readers, and gave incentive to narrate distant wars and explore dark lands. On other tablets are recorded the names of northern and southern correspondents and artists who helped usher in a new age of journalism. They were the first embedded journalists covering the first instant news war, transmitting stories long distances over telegraph lines and traveling hundreds of miles on horseback and steam driven trains. And their newspapers used huge steam-powered presses to print their eyewitness reports from, quote, from the seat of war. America was becoming a nation of newspaper readers. The invention of the kerosene lamp in 1830 had extended the length of time for reading. At the time the war broke out, the reporters had no idea what lay ahead for them or how they would write an important part of journalism history. The memorial of stone, bricks, and mortar on South Mountain was left by George Alfred Townsend. You can see him there. He was one of those pioneering reporters, a member of the Bohemian Brigade, the name given the free-spirited nonconformist journalists of the time. Townsend graduated from high school in Philadelphia in 1860 and got a job as a news editor at the Inquire the same day, later going on to other newspapers. At the time, the paper was located at 3rd and Carter's Alley, south of Chestnut Street. Parts of the presses and other artifacts from that building were found during construction work there. The Inquirer moved from there in 1863 to a 5-story brick building at 304 Chestnut Street, where it installed a new steam-powered bullet printing press, the first of its kind in the world. It could print on both sides of the paper from one feeding. And the Inquirer name was, you can't see it here, but you'll see it in some other pictures I'll show you later. The Inquirer name was plastered all over the building. I often wonder what it would be like to wander in there. The paper, started by John Norval in 1829, was much different from the one covering the Civil War. I've actually handled a lot of letters that Norval wrote when I went to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And it was fascinating because he corresponded with a lot of important people, including Thomas Jefferson. The advocacy press that helped in the founding and forming of the country was giving way to more populist newspapers. The Inquirer supported Lincoln, but didn't sugarcoat the war news. Other publications, such as the Chester County Times, were more partisan, unashamedly pro-Lincoln, and less objective. The Inquirer's editor and publisher, William Harding, enlarged the staff and demanded that his correspondence be the best, first with the breaking news. The reporters came through repeatedly, often with the fullest accounts of battles that would determine the outcome of the war. Circulation grew from 7,000 in the 1850s to about 70,000 in 1863. The Philadelphia Press, the Inquirer's chief rival, was said to have complained that Inquirer correspondents seemed to know more about the war than the generals. John Forney, editor of the press, tried to battle back, ordering his reporters to give him, quote, not sensation inventions, but real news. We must be behind no longer. You can see the layout of papers, you know, the way they did their headlines is quite a bit different from our papers today. The Inquirer is, as a collectible, is coveted because it often had a map or image of an event or a leader on the front page. This New York Illustrated News is another one that had some art there. Harper's Weekly was among the more popular papers for the same reason. people used to gather at newspapers to see headlines were plastered up on the wall. The Inquirer covered all kinds of news, not only in the battles far away, but local news. Here you can see the paper covered. They reported on a prototype, a submarine prototype that was developed in Philadelphia and tested in the Delaware River, causing quite a stir. This was the one I was looking for in the Rancocas, because I had understood that it was stored along the banks of the Rancocas, and that it either sank there or was embedded in the mud. And I went out there. We didn't find it, but it might be there. We just haven't found it. Back then it was like, was it a monster or some infernal machine sent by the Confederacy to destroy Federal ships? You can see if you can read it, I don't know. The stories were written in a rather dramatic way. Never since the days of the Battle of the Kegs has the riverfront of Philadelphia been the scene of such a peculiar excitement as yesterday, and on and on. So the crowds gathered to watch the harbor police capture this thing and chain it to the Noble Street Pier. One of the Inquirer's most celebrated reporters was Uriah Hunt Painter. He provided the first accurate full-length report of the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. It looks like somebody you'd see on the street today, doesn't he? It's an interesting picture of him. The battle appeared at first, the Battle of Bull Run, at first to have been won by Union forces. So some reporters, such as John Russell Young of the Philadelphia Press, left the field to send reports of a victory. Henry Jarvis Raymond of the New York Times wired his paper with a full account of what appeared to be a full federal success, though he said, quote, the result was still not certain. They were stunned by the Union defeat. Meanwhile, Painter of the Inquirer and Edmund Clarence Stedman of the New York World had watched the Federals abruptly retreat. They even tried to personally rally the troops to turn and fight. Charles Carlton Coffin of the Boston Journal witnessed a key Union failure when an advancing Confederate regiment was mistaken for Union reinforcements, which ultimately captured a key Federal artillery position. Ultimately, after seeing the wounded and dead on the battlefield, losing a horse, and grabbing a wounded Confederate mount, Painter returned to Washington, where he decided not to wait for the busy telegraph office, and he didn't want to wait either for government censors to approve what he'd written. So he hopped a crowded train for Philly and had to travel in the baggage car, where he caught up on some sleep. When Painter arrived at the Inquirer, his editors didn't believe his account because of earlier reports of victory and wouldn't accept his story until they began hearing other evidence of defeat. The Inquirer published an extra edition on July 22nd with the first true account of what happened. Large crowds gathered outside of the paper and determined, or they threatened to burn down the paper for dispensing Southern propaganda. There were a lot of Copperheads, Southern sympathizers in Philadelphia. A more lengthy eyewitness account by Painter appeared on July 23rd, and there it is. And you can see there in that middle column, it's his full account of the Great Battle of Manassas Junction. And instead of by Uriah Hunt Painter, it says by an eyewitness. You didn't see a lot of bylines back then. The newspaper reporters were trying to figure out how to cover the war as they went along. They were kind of making this up as they went along. You can see some of the Bohemian Brigade there at a little cart there, looking at some papers, Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore papers. And here is some folks at the cart of wagon of Matthew Brady. I'm not sure who they are there, but that's what they were identified as. And this is not a particularly good picture, but Harper's Weekly put the press in the field and made woodcut representations of what it looked like. But imagine, you're traveling with the army on horseback. You had no iPhone, no iPad, laptop to communicate, take photos, or send stories. You hope to get the latest from officers, and sometimes you might climb a tree or a hill to get a better view, but you can also get killed or captured. Some reporters hung out at Willard's Hotel in Washington, where a lot of the government and military officials could be found. They could also send their dispatches from there. Meanwhile, the South had fewer papers and even less paper to print them on. People couldn't get enough of the war news. The graphics on the front pages of the Inquirer helped them better grasp what was going on. I believe this was probably during the Peninsula Campaign, I think. And it's talking about Yorktown. And you can see another one here of McClellan's terrific engagements. And but the maps help people understand what was going on, and these papers were coveted by the enemy as well, because they got some intelligence from some of it. Painter, Uriah Hunt Painter, also covered the Battle of Gettysburg, where July 3rd copies of the paper's coverage of the first day's fight were hawked among the troops, even as the 3-day. Clash continued. He covered the fighting July 1, traveled July 2 to Baltimore, where he telegraphed the War Department in Washington. The censor passed the story to the Inquirer, which printed it and sent copies by train to Baltimore, then Westminster, Maryland. Bundles were picked up there by a boy named Cullen Doc Aubrey and taken by horse to Gettysburg, where all of them were quickly purchased by Union troops. I believe he said they went like gingerbread at the state fair. Now here, this is a year after this last, exactly 1 year after this front page that you're looking at here. Here is 1 year later, and July 4, 1863, Inquire. And the reports of the battle were coming back to the Inquirer's office. There it is right there. You can see better now the name of the Inquirer on the building. Doesn't look like much, does it? But they were printing a lot of newspapers out of there. One of the touching stories to appear in the Inquirer some time later involved Sergeant Amos Humiston, who was mortally wounded at Gettysburg and dragged himself to a secluded spot where he was found dead, still clutching a bloodstained glass plate photograph of his 3 children. He carried no identifying papers, just the photo. A Philadelphia physician, John Francis Bournes, he lived on Spring Garden Street. He came to Gettysburg to care for the wounded, learned of the story, and shared it in the Inquirer with a headline, "Whose father is he?" Was he, that is. The article was reprinted in other publications, and Humiston's wife, Philinda of Portville, New York, saw it and wrote to Dr. Bournes. Eventually, Borns capitalized on the public response and helped raise donations for an orphanage in Gettysburg for children of fallen Union soldiers. The orphanage lasted about 12 years. Unfortunately, not always the great ending that you would hope for. Its matron was accused of abusing children, and Dr. Borns was accused of embezzling some donated money. But Humiston's story still has a touching quality. In May 1864, and I know this is a story Andy will enjoy, Inquire reporter Edward Cropsey, he probably liked to call it Cropsey, but whatever, sent a letter to the paper laying out the roles of Major General Ulysses S. Grant, who commanded all the armies in the field, and General George Gordon Meade, who commanded the Army of the Potomac and was the victorious commander at Gettysburg. The letter was an analysis that seemed to praise Meade and then take a swipe at him for being too timid. It was perhaps not meant to end up in the paper the way it was sent, but it did, throwing General Meade into a rage. And the general ordered Cropsey arrested and later mounted backwards on a mule and forced to wear a placard marked libeler of the press while a band played the Rogues' March. And the newsman was expelled from the camp, returned to Washington, where he called a meeting of other correspondents who agreed that Meade would be omitted from future dispatches unless the news was negative. Sometimes reporters, like I said before, they were captured along with the soldiers. I had a lot of ground to cover, so I would spend more time with that other story, but I'm trying to cover some more ground here. Among those who were captured was William E. Davis of the Cincinnati Gazette, Bert Richardson and Junius Brown of the New York Tribune. Here's William E. Davis of the Cincinnati Gazette and Junius Brown of the New York Tribune, and Bert Richardson of the New York Tribune. And they were held in miserable Confederate prisons and later escaped. Some other reporters had other interesting adventures. When Richmond fell, Thomas Morris Chester of the Philadelphia Press made his way to the Capitol when Richmond fell, and he sat down in the speaker's chair to write a dispatch. He was the only Black correspondent of the war that I could find. A paroled Confederate soldier ordered him to leave and then set upon him and was punched in the eye by Chester and sent tumbling. The Confederate asked a Union officer for a sword to cut out Chester's heart, was refused, and departed in frustration. Some of the more famous Inquirer front pages came out following the assassination of President Lincoln. You can see here, you see those dark lines between the columns sort of indicating, mourning. And again, the picture of Booth, a map of the area where the theater is. This is, I think, a tremendous front page. It's one of my favorites, just for the layout and, the way it draws you in. Of course, this is when the Lincoln's remains were in Independence Hall, lying in state. And the Union League building on Broad Street is one of my favorite places. I've been there many times covering renovations, special exhibits, and new art acquisitions. But one story that stayed with me was about James Tanner, a Union soldier who lost both legs in Second Manassas and later ended up recording the testimony of witnesses to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln while the president lay dying across the hallway from him. He could hear the president's labored breathing and Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, sobbing. And she was finally removed at one point. I entered a vault there and saw Tanner's shorthand, which is a direct connection to that horrible night. It was amazing. The Inquire would move from Chestnut Street to Chestnut Street here, and you can see Chestnut Street there, and the Inquire is all the way to the left there in this particular picture. It moved from there to Market Street. This is a painting. It was around the early 1900s. You can see the Inquire there on Market on the right-hand side. I always liked that painting, and I got a copy of it and put it here in my little library. Then it moved on to Broad Street, the one that you're probably very familiar with. I remember coming up in 1976. I think that was the year of Legionnaire's disease, and my newspaper in Baltimore sent me up to cover the Legionnaire's disease and stay at the Bellevue Stratford where it broke out. Maybe they wanted a first-person story. I don't know. In case I got it, and I drove up to see the paper. The building is interesting. It's modeled after the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the wonders, of the ancient world. And it actually, if you look at, there was paintings done of that lighthouse, and you can look it up online, and there was a pretty good similarity. Of course, the lighthouse doesn't exist; it came down, but apparently someone did a likeness of it before it came down, and the idea of the Inquirer lighthouse, shedding light on the news, anyway, then it's now moved from there to 8th and Market, and now it's supposed to move to Independence Mall. Before there's a place that I ran in with news all the time, 400 North Broad, and the lobby. They still kept that. Now it's police headquarters, obviously. They kept a lot of this decoration in the lobby, including that globe. Before I conclude, I wanted to briefly mention an effort to honor a largely unsung group of men who helped maintain the freedoms proclaimed in Philadelphia, the combat glider pilots of World War II. There's a glider being towed. You can see the line pulling it from the front there. They flew aircraft with no motors, no weapons, no armor plating of any kind at all. Here's the cockpit of one. You can see very, very simple. Not much to it. The gliders were ugly, squat, little more than gray-green fabric stretched over a framework of metal tubing and wood. Because here's one's coming down, smashed through a tree. They don't have much control once they hit the release. They're coming down, and no stopping them. Yet they become America's silent winged Air Force, the airborne trucks of World War II, ferrying troops, jeeps, artillery into battles all across the globe, in Burma, Italy, Europe, everywhere. The pilots wore silver wings emblazoned with the letter G, and told everyone the G stood for guts. They cut off from C-47 tow planes, plummeted out of the sky at up to 90 miles an hour, and made controlled crashes through a hail of bullets and flak. My father, James Colimore, that's him, he flew 3 combat missions into Normandy on D-Day and a couple of others. He found on D-Day, he flew into St. Mary-Glees, and he found a good spot when he was coming down. And others didn't. And this is my father next to a cross of grave of a friend, another glider pilot. He has several pictures like this, quite a few at other graves. He wanted to remember them. On D-Day, he, like I say, he flew into St. Mary Glees. I found a good spot, came down, but other gliders, well, unfortunately, some ran into cows in the field. And there was my father remembered an elderly lady coming out and shouting at everybody in French with the bullets flying all around. And he said, "Get down, you fool." And later on, he went over to another glider that had come down, and he looked inside, and all the airborne troops were sitting there, strapped in, guns between their legs. All of them were dead. They had been machine gunned by Germans before they got a chance to get out. He headed back after they stopped the Germans from reinforcing the beach, which is what their role was. They didn't want any reinforcements coming to the beach so we could get a toehold there. Once he saw them coming up from the beach, he started heading back because he was under orders to get a vessel to get back to England because they needed him again. On the way back, there were German snipers taking pot shots at him and others. One of the German snipers didn't quite make it, and my father went over and he picked up this scope that the German was using to spot Americans, and he took it as a souvenir. And then he eventually, going back about 12, 13 miles to the beach, got to the beach, and the beach was strafed by a German plane. And he ran out to I think it was the Higgins boat, to get out to a larger ship to get back to England. And he got out in the water, could hardly get up into that vessel. They had to grab him by the seat of his pants and pull him in. And when he got in there, he found a bunch of German prisoners. And he started collecting more souvenirs, including a German officer's hat. And he took medals and, patches off their uniforms, and now I have it. I remember seeing a song that the airborne troops that went in the gliders, they considered that to be hazardous duty, at least as hazardous as the paratroopers, who got more pay than they did. And they wrote a song that said, "Once I was happy, but now I'm airborne, flying in gliders all tattered and torn." And then there was a line that said, "And the pay is exactly the same." In other words, the same as any ground troop. My father also participated in Operation Market Garden, went into Holland. This is his glider. There were so many gliders coming in at the same time that rather than hit one in midair, he had to take a steep dive. And of course, he went in nose first, and he was crushed in the cockpit. And it took a while to get him extricated from that mess. They didn't have jaws of life. And they got him out of there, and there was another man on top of him who was bleeding on him. And then they put him on the hood of a Jeep, and two men drove him down the road. And the German 88s were pounding the area. And the two men got out of the Jeep and went over to the side into the gully and took cover and left my father there on the hood. And then when the firing stopped, they got in the Jeep and took him to where he could get some attention. There was a medic came up to him, and he always carried a chocolate bar in his pocket for energy. And the medic looked at him and said, "I don't think he's going to need this chocolate bar." And they took it. So he figured he was a goner. But they got him back to England, and they patched him up and gave him a Purple Heart, and said, "Well, we need you again." So they put him in a glider on the way to Germany, over the Rhine, Operation Varsity. I thought about my father when I was flying in the present day cargo aircraft, a gigantic C-17. That's me in the cockpit there. And they've got enough room there to seat 4. And there was a place to sleep right behind me. We were carrying a unit of a large unit of soldiers. We were headed to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. We're carrying soldiers, a large jet engine, helicopter blades, a disassembled outbuilding, but we had power, and we had, we were able to make a soft landing. And, I was thankful for that. I've never flown in a glider, and I don't think I want to. The late news anchor, Walter Cronkite, was covering World War II for UPI, and actually flew in a glider into Holland during Operation Market Garden. Years later, he said it was so noisy with the air rushing by the fabric that it was like being in a bass drum at a rock concert. And that's not the one I wanted to show. Oh, that is one that the photographer took of me sleeping in the C-17. I guess that's the latter day version of Uriah Hunt Painter sleeping in the rail baggage car. You just had to sleep wherever you could. The flights were very long. And this is a glider at the Silent Wings Museum in Lubbock, Texas. They have the full-scale glider and other planes. You can see the front of it is an older, airport tower, a brick building from the time when gliders and glider pilots were being used in this area. The pilots trained in this area. That's why they created that museum. And then they made a more modern part on the other side. This is a C-17, the kind that towed the gliders. When the glider, when Cronkite was flying in the glider, it landed, or rather crashed, he lost his helmet and picked up another. Soon, airborne troops were coming up to him and asking him what they should do, where they should go. And he says, I don't know, I'm a war correspondent. Well, you better get that helmet off your head. You picked up a lieutenant's helmet. They thought he was an officer. Cronkite said the experience was a, quote, lifelong cure for constipation. I'll tell you straight out, if you've got to go into combat, don't go by glider, he later wrote. Walk, crawl, parachute, swim, float, anything, but don't go by glider. It takes tremendous courage, said Cronkite in an interview years later. Those glider pilots were absolutely sensational. A new website that I created, by the way, combatgliders.com, has just been launched. It's combatgliders.com. It provides a history of the glider pilots and describes the effort of the World War II Glider Pilots Monument Foundation to honor these heroes with a bronze statue to be placed at the Silent Wings Museum. And that's the place where they're going to put it, right to the rear of the C-47. The model for the statue has been completed by nationally renowned sculptor Chad Fisher. Chad did the statue of several veterans. Wild Bill Guinier was one. You remember him from the band of brothers. And also he did one of Michael Crescenz, the only recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor in Philadelphia during the Vietnam War. And like I say, this is the model. He'll be doing some updates on it here and there. And he is donating his skills, his time, the use of his foundry, and all he needs is the funds for the clay, bronze, and other materials. The figure of the glider pilot is looking to the sky as if watching gliders being towed toward the English Channel and a landing at Normandy. These brave men help defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan and preserve the freedoms laid out in Philadelphia. This is my father, again. He's looking like something out of film noir, like John Garfield. And you can see the glider wings there on his chest. I was talking with Herb earlier, and I told him about I have a very large collection of Civil War books and World War II books, probably of over 1,000, and I have a lot of Civil War relics. And I was talking to him about this one. I don't know if we have anybody that knows anything from looking at this. I don't know. This was given to me. This is this object here. It was marked as coming from the USS Kearsarge. I'm not quite sure what it is. It was under the floorboards of a house in Manayunk with that tag on it, and also was a rivet from the USS Monitor and some other things. People sometimes would just give me things like this because they know I was interested in the Civil War, and I'm not quite sure what this is. If anybody later on has an idea, maybe you can let me know. I also was telling Herb I have in the basement a diorama of the Battle of Antietam, and Herb, this is for you. This is part of the diorama in my basement.
Oh my God!
That's the town.
Wow.
That's the town of Sharpsburg. I'd need a drone to get a full sweeping picture of the whole setup, because it's rather large. But I represented each part of the battle. I think this is the Burnside Bridge here, and the Antietam Creek, and we have I have some other bridges too on here because there were, and the figures are some are lead, and some are air fix, I think they call, like plastic, and that is
That's unbelievable.
yeah,
That's Ed, I have to jump in here. That's incredible. Oh my God, that's just amazing.
But anyway, that's about it.
All right, Ed. If you, I just want to mention one thing quickly. We have a very good member of our museum named Dan Cashin, who is a naval historian. He knows more about the Navy and naval ships than anybody else. If you would be kind enough, take a picture of that relic you have, and
Right.
if you can email me a picture, I will send it on to, or what I can do also, I'll just send you his email.
Right.
And if you email it to him, ask him, Dan can probably identify it.
Well, it looks like something like, they put something through it.
Yeah, I'm really, I think Dan Cashin,
Like it involved ropes, maybe ropes or something. I don't know.
well, he's a Navy guy. He can probably tell you. Now, at this point, Ed, so we can see the people, you want to just stop your screen share.
Okay, wait
So
a minute.
right at the top, it'll say stop screen share.
Okay.
There you go. Now you're back. There you go.
Yeah, by the
All
way,
right.
before you say that, the USS Kearsarge, for anybody who doesn't know, was a Union ship that sank the CSS Alabama off the coast of Cherbourg, France. And it was kind of a famous gun battle there. And anyway, that just so you know.
All right. Is there, I saw one question that came up on the chat, and that is a person who wants to know, how did the soldiers in the field get their newspapers? How were they delivered to them?
Yeah. Well, I believe that, just like that Aubrey, Cullen Aubrey, they always had somebody who could strap some, bundles of papers, after they'd been sent by train, out to a location where they could be picked up and taken out to where, the action was happening. So I think that would be one way. I mean, there probably were other ways. They're doing a lot of traveling. It might have been difficult. I'm sure they didn't have copies of the newspaper at every battle. There's too much chaos. As my wife, who was, we were married in Barranquilla, Colombia, in South America, right? And she would say, "Desorde is chaos. Is chaos, disorder."
All right. What I'd like to do is invite people. Oh, Andy's waving. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, there's another question from chat that talked about mail. Did the mail flow freely from the south to the north and vice versa without interruption or interference? Do you know that, Ed?
I don't know that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Charles Bogart, can I step in and comment upon that?
Sure.
What happened was at the beginning of the war, the Confederate government began to use U.S. postage stamps. They were flowing north, and Joshua Speed of Louisville, Abraham Lincoln's friend who was postmaster in Louisville, said one day, "Wait a minute, they're sending this mail up here, and they are not reversing the money to Washington, they're sending it to Richmond, and we're losing out on this deal." Montgomery Blair, who was from Frankfort, Kentucky, where I now live, as Postmaster General, said, "Oh, from this point on, we don't exchange mail back across the border. And by the way, we're going to issue all new stamps." So there's a whole new set of stamps that come out in 1862, I believe it is. And all the previous stamps can no longer be used. So that's when you see the Confederates scrambling to buy their own stamps and have them printed in Great Britain and come in, or there's provisionals been made. But the only mail that after that is exchanged is either run by, called blockade runners, for better or worse term, who bring it across. And then once again, the United States side, they put a U.S. stamp on it, or the Confederate side put a Confederate stamp on it. Or there's official exchange by military officers when they're doing a prisoner parole. But otherwise, mail is just stopped between the two contending sides.
Okay,
That's
thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, Ed, you have a number of very florid and exuberant thank yous for your brilliant performance and presentation from various people. I won't name everybody, but they're on the chat and they wanted to extend their thanks and gratitude. So, and I second all of that, of course. It's a brilliant presentation, and thank you so much. And by the way, you're collecting donations for that monument for the combat glider pilots, maybe on Zoom, or you could send it to me by email, whatever the address and details, and I can send it out in case they would like to donate.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Does anyone have a question?
I'll throw
Yes,
one more comment. I
Adams,
thought it was
sir.
interesting.
Ellis Adams I saw first. I saw Ellis Adams first.
Sorry.
Then you're next, Gail. Or Charles, I'm sorry. Ellis, unmute yourself. Ellis is a member of Post 405 at the Union League. Air Force veteran. Ellis? No. No. Okay.
No.
Well, let's go to Charles then. did you say you had a comment or question?
Yeah, by the way, Sons of Union Veterans post at Lexington, Kentucky, Mars. Throw that in. Here, your comment that you made about the newspaper reporters getting together and saying that they weren't going to report Meade's name any longer. I guess that's the reason why the whole war in the East then becomes Grant's name and Meade drops out of the picture. Is that
Amen.
what happens?
Yes. Yes, to a large degree. I'll answer that, Ed.
Yeah.
And he was always depicted in a negative
There's a whole
vein.
bag of tiles.
Sorry, my dog is scratching at the door.
Okay. All right, thank you. Anyone else? Ellis, did you unmute yourself?
Oh, I'm back on now that I
Oh,
got.
good. Okay. Ellis Adams.
Yeah, my question regards the illustrations that went along with newspaper stories. My understanding was always that most of them were done as wood engravings, which would hold up under print run.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And did those illustrators go along with the other correspondents in the field? How did those things get
Yes.
translated?
Yeah.
back to the press?
There were illustrators that went along in the field, and I think some of the illustrations were done, like of individuals, like John Wilkes Booth. People had his picture. He was very famous. Probably more pictures of him, Lincoln and Custer, than anybody else back then. But they'd take those pictures and then they'd create a woodcut from that. They make their illustration based on that picture. But I mean, there had illustrators that went along. I have a book of one particular illustrator. I forget his name now. They did go out there in the field.
I just wanted to say one other thing. That diorama of Antietam really fascinated me, and partly because my great grandfather went across the Burnside Bridge when the Ninth Corps was in the last assault of the day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else have a question? Please don't be afraid. Bernice.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for really a brilliant illuminating presentation, Mr. Colimore. It was wonderful. And since you are the historian for the Inquire, I'm wondering, and excuse me if I didn't do my homework on this, did you ever write about Charles Dickens? I know, of course, it's before your time, but did you ever write about Charles Dickens' 2 visits to Philadelphia, which were very historical in actual fact and drew large crowds of folks here in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I believe he went up to the prison, right?
Eastern
Yeah.
State, yes.
Yeah. Well, he had
Right.
2. In the second visit, he even met with Andrew Johnson very briefly. But I'm talking more in Philadelphia because he spent 4 or 5 days in Philadelphia during his first visit, and then the second visit, several days too.
I have mentioned these things in some of my stories. I don't remember what the circumstances were. I mean, I often dipped into many things, like, for instance, at the Academy of Music, Adelina Patti, the famous opera singer of the time, and a little romantic dalliance that she had with the British royal, I think it was Edward. And there'd be little things like that I that would in the course of writing a story about the history of Philadelphia, I would dip into something, but I don't remember doing anything just specifically on a whole story on Dickens in particular.
And he also incidentally had a brief meeting with Edgar Allan Poe here in Philadelphia. Poe sought him out. But I just had wondered, but thank you for everything, because your presentation was so illuminating.
Thanks. I wondered whether Edgar Allan Poe ever visited Laurel Hill Cemetery. Do you know, Andy?
I'd like to think he did, but I can't document it. But it was a very, very well appreciated and loved tourist site, and the cemetery company would give free. They had an office downtown, and you could go in there, ask for a ticket, free of charge. And then you could go up and visit, and hundreds of thousands would visit each year. So it was quite a mecca for Philadelphia. By the way, I wanted to say that Dickens, in his will, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, stated that he did not want any monuments or memorials to himself. And so there's only one in the world, and it's in
more
Park
now. There are
in
more
West
now.
Philadelphia, and it's he with Little Nell from his stories.
I remember that. Sure.
There's several more now, Andy.
What's that?
There's several more now. They bypass, so you know, his will, but there are
Well,
several more of his statues of Dickens now.
but not in Philadelphia. This must.
Oh, no, not in Philadelphia. No, I'm talking about abroad.
Good. Thanks. One last thing I want to say. Ed came to the reenactment at Gettysburg, the 125th in 1988. Reenactment, and we had, if I'm not mistaken, 12 to 15,000 participants, as well as tens of thousands of visitors who were charged a fee. And it was up to that time the largest battle reenactment in history, but it was widely eclipsed for the 150th. I'm sorry, not 150th, 135th, where they stopped counting at 30,000 participants. And that was down at the not at the Eisenhower Farm, Bullfrog Road. By the way, I portrayed General Meade there. Just want to mention. And at the 125th, we shared a tent together.
That's right.
You remember? Okay. Anyone
I
else?
remember. And you know, sitting there at the campfire with you, and,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
and everybody would lapse into their Union soldier personality.
Saunas. Yeah. Exactly.
And I was very cold in that tent. I mean, the days were extremely hot, but not cold.
I can't, right?
Okay.
All right.
So
Thank
you, Ed. Thank you. Anyone else?
Andy, let me just say, we're running late.
Okay.
So we're going to thank everybody for participating. A lot of people have already regretfully left us, but we want to thank you all for participating. We hope you enjoyed it. Andy, do you know who is our speaker in June?
Oh, yes. It will be Deb Goodrich on tape, but it will be her history of the Santa Fe Trail. She is a historian and member of the board of the Santa Fe Trail Association. And I interviewed her some time ago and recorded it for this just such an event. So we will post it for June 5th, but really you can watch it anytime you want because it's pre-recorded. And that's Deb Goodrich. She's a famous historian of the West, coming from Kansas. She's spoken around the area here, Del Valle Civil Roundtable, the Union League, et cetera, et cetera. She's a very dear friend. And that will be our speaker for June 5th.
Okay, we will send out an announcement as to how to access that presentation, and it will also be on our website under the events section. So first, let me just thank Ed Colimore. Ed, you were fabulous.
Thank you.
Absolutely breathtaking. I just enjoyed it. We want to thank everyone for joining us. And Ed, I will send you the information for Dan Cashin, and I'll let him know that you're going to contact him.
Okay.
Send him a picture, and I'll bet you he can tell you what it is.
Okay.
He's the best naval historian I know.
I agree.
So it was a great pleasure to hear you today. I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you when our museum opens. So thank you all, and have a pleasant rest of the day.
Thank you.